real excited about being able to present our point of view on transformation and the impact of synchronizing business processes. What really excites me, though, is the experiences our guests are going to be sharing later today and how they've led organizations through successful transformation journeys. Before we get started, I do want to put a couple things in perspective as it pertains to the rapidly changing marketplace. Creative destruction continues to be at high levels. After a plunge in activity due to COVID, major rebounds we're seeing in private equity, M&A, IPOs are all leading indicators and continued future rise in the value of the S&P 500. If we track the longevity of companies in the S&P 500, we're starting to see a steady churn rate of companies dropping off the index as new entrants join the list and corporate lifespans continued downward trajectory. The full impact of this global pandemic is yet to be known and will play out over the next couple of years. But we are seeing signs pointing to ongoing change in consumer and market behavior and that were previously underway, but the pandemic sharply accelerated it. As a long-time trend, the digital revolution has already reshaped the S&P 500. If we look at the 1970s, industrial companies represented about a third of that index. A half century later, only 68 companies of the S&P 500 are industrials. Over the same span, infotech companies went from 16 to 68, and now are tied for the top spot in the S&P 500. Innovation has flourished during the pandemic as new solutions have displaced the way we work and the way work has been done before. As all the creative destruction makes its way through the economy, disrupted forces are especially concentrated in several areas that we're seeing in the industries. Industries are being blurred together. And if you look at the fast growing industries, it's kind of a hybrid approach. Now, what we're seeing most notably is things like digital healthcare, fintech, retail entertainment industries, as well as e-mobility are all combining to create new fast growing hybrid industries. Next slide. And we can all agree that the marketplace is moving and it's changing pretty quickly. If you look at the increasing speeds and the way we're investing in digital transformation efforts, it is a trend that's not only been here, but continues in the future. What separates successful organizations and their digital transformation journeys from the ones that fall short, the differentiator is in the deployment of digital business models that start with clear strategy, intentionally integrating people, process, and technology for sustainable transformation. I'm going to underscore sustainable because if we look at the environment we're in right now, the only constant we really have is change. Organizational tension is created when any of the primary factors basically fall out. And what I mean by the primary factors is that integrating people, process, and technology. When strategy gets set aside as technical teams start their implementation without a clear understanding of the organizational goals, or legacy processes shape strategies to evolve kind of the what needs to be accomplished. This tension is not a singular event, but a challenge that most organizations have to manage over time and the length of their transformation. The pandemic has really forced us to embrace the digital, embrace digital technologies on a day-to-day activity. We've all seen and embraced Zoom. We're on a Zoom call today where in the past, we may have been at an event altogether. Whether it's Zoom, Teams, Slack, all the various collaboration technologies have increased our productivity and collaboration. But if we look at the progress that's being made around some of the technologies to improve collaboration, many of us are still dealing with front office applications and back office applications that are still very fragmented. We've got unoptimized operating models and we're not fully embracing the skills that are and roles that are needed for the digital market as we see things today. What corporations are looking to do in a highly destructive environment, along with providing some clarity and purpose, vision, and strategy, we will believe that those are going to be the key to the longevity in the future. Reducing the friction in our operating models, our employees, our customers, our suppliers, and our partners are going to be a key to success in the future. This is what we're referring to our business synchrony approach. So later today, you're going to hear from 4 companies that have really embraced components of the Synchrony framework. Tallgrass Energy, who started with a very clear strategy, but now have really been laying the foundation for a agile digital foundation to meet their ever-changing business needs. FedCap Group, serving their employees and their members via an optimized organizational design and talent management supporting system. Nationwide, using analytics and metrics, making sure that the right measures are utilized to manage their suppliers and labor spend. And then finally, CDPHP, how does software-enabled processes create a more agile business solution environment? Today, I've got 3 colleagues joining us. Alistair Trotter, Frank Capek, and Jess Jones. We're going to bring different views and different personas to the perspective of our Synchrony journey. So Alistair, let me hand it over to you now.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Mario. I'm honored to have the opportunity to share a few words about Synchrony and enterprise strategy, which is one of the core elements of business synchrony. I am a managing director at Insight, Huron's growth strategy and innovation group. Now, I'd like to start by picking up on one of the comments that Mario mentioned in his opening. And if we turn the slide here, what I'd like to do is show that the average company lifespan that Mario referenced, and just dig into this a little bit more. What we're looking at here is essentially how long a company spends on the S&P 500 index and how that is changing over time. And this is the only chart I'm going to show, but I think it underscores just how dramatic this shift is. While there are certainly ups and downs as the rate at which companies enter and exit accelerates due to economic cycles, the overall trend here is most certainly downwards. Indeed, the average tenure has dropped from a high of nearly 35 years back in 1980 to just 18 last year, and is set to fall further over the next 5 years as we witness the consequences of the many disruptions taking place across multiple industries. Right, this shows a 7-year rolling average, so we're yet to see the full impact of these changes that are happening and which indeed have been accelerated in many cases by the global pandemic. You know, to make this real, if we just think back through the last 12 months alone, we've witnessed a number of once iconic companies fall from grace. Brands that we're all familiar with, such as Xerox, Tiffany's, E-Trade, H&R Block, Macy's, Nordstrom's, Harley-Davidson, to name just a few. These organizations employed hundreds of thousands of the smartest, brightest people that we might ever work with, but their collective wisdom and efforts were insufficient to transform those organizations in the face of the massive amounts of market change that is happening all around us. So let's look in a little more detail at this transformation challenge. Transformational change is required when your markets are changing in such a way that the business model on which your organization has relied historically is unlikely to be sustainable into the future. Now, every industry faces changing consumer behaviors. Consumers expect digital experience. They expect to have the flexibility to work and play from wherever they are. They expect to have choices. They expect you to protect their data and use it wisely to delight them. Their expectations are set and reset on a daily basis by those firms that push the boundaries and redefine what great customer experiences look like. Now, every industry also has disruptive forces in the form of new technologies, nimble new competitors, regulatory change. And while these forces may create new opportunities, they also threaten established business models and the margins of incumbent players. And together, these two forces exert a constant pressure on every ecosystem, These forces reshape value chains, disintermediate relationships, and ultimately change how and where value will be created and captured within the ecosystem. Now, most organizations see these changes coming, but are either paralyzed from acting, perhaps confident in the belief that disruption is something that happens to other industries, or because they fail to ground their transformations in a deeper understanding of what will really be required to serve their customers in the future. Enterprise strategy is the linchpin of business synchrony. Enterprise strategy is about figuring out what the ecosystem in which you compete will look like in the future, what role your organization aspires to play in that future, which customers you aspire to serve, and how you will create compelling and differentiated solutions relative to your future competitors. Wayne Gretzky put this perhaps more succinctly with, you need to skate to where the puck will be. Without enterprise strategy, digital transformations are at risk of mindlessly perpetuating a struggling business model into the future. Without enterprise strategy, customer experience transformations are at risk of creating elegant experiences which fail to address the most important needs that customers will have in the future. Without enterprise strategy, cultural transformations can leave a workforce inspired but ill-equipped to address the challenges they will need to face in the future. Striving for business synchrony requires that teams wrestle with critical questions about the nature of changing ecosystems and the viability of existing business models. For example, we have these three questions here on the slide. Will it be sufficient to double down on the business you have to deliver against your aspiration? Or will you need to serve new customers in new ways with new business models? What role will digital play? And is the purpose of our digital transformation simply to digitize existing workflows and customer experiences, or to enable fundamentally new digital business models? And perhaps most importantly, what capabilities and operating models will be required in order for the organization to successfully navigate this changing landscape? Huron works with leadership teams, and you will hear from them later today about how they wrestle with these questions to develop a future-oriented enterprise strategy. So let's look quickly at how we do this. First, leadership teams need to develop and align on their points of view about what that future environment will look like. Later this afternoon, you'll hear from CDPHP, a healthcare insurer, who has developed a point of view about the value-based care ecosystem, the overlapping roles that traditional providers and payers will play, which will certainly improve patient experiences, but will also change how value will be created and captured within that healthcare ecosystem. Second, leadership teams need to choose the role that their organization will play in that future ecosystem. Will you sit tight and evolve your business model into new areas within the ecosystem, or leverage capabilities to extend into entirely new ecosystems altogether? Later today, you'll hear from our friends at Tallgrass Energy, who after their partnership with Blackstone, reimagined their role as a platform for growth within the midstream energy ecosystem, and from the FedCat Group, who saw huge runway for future growth by serving their constituents in new ways in more locations around the globe. Third, leadership teams need to wrestle with the growth gap. This is the gap that will exist in the future between what will happen if you fail to transform, essentially the perpetuated version of what you do today, and the aspiration that you have for yourself in the future. Now, this gap will be financial, but it will also be a gap in capabilities and in skills. And it is this gap that transformation must close. Fourth, leadership teams should align on the transformation portfolio, the full and indeed synchronous set of transformations that will be required to close the gap. This is inclusive of any digital transformation activities, but must also include all the various capability building, skill building, business model innovation, and culture transforming initiatives that must happen in parallel. And this afternoon, you'll hear from several organizations who started out with a limited view of the nature of that gap and their transformation portfolio, but quickly realized the magnitude of the required change and the need for synchrony between their strategy, technology, and people transformations. And finally, leadership teams must define the key milestones and the operating model that is required to govern that transformation. Achieving synchrony is not a checkbox or a one-time activity that can be completed, but an equilibrium that must be maintained throughout a transformation. This afternoon, you'll hear from the FedCat Group and Nationwide, who will share more on how they managed and set up their operating model to drive their transformation to achieve synchrony across the various activities. And with that, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon and find something valuable in these discussions to bring back to your organization. And so with that, let me hand you over to my colleague, Frank Capek, to talk more about the role of Synchrony in driving customer experience.
Thanks, Alistair. Hello, everyone. I am also a partner managing director at Huron's Innosight group. And so just by way of background, I've spent the past 35 years working with hundreds of organizations on customer experience transformation programs. In the early 90s, I launched what was the very first practice focused on the integration of customer experience, employee experience, and growth. And as we go to the next slide, one of the things that we've seen over this time as the entire field of customer-focused transformation and customer experience has matured, we're finding that most organizations are stuck due to several critical disconnects. And so starting with the left-hand side of this page, over the past 2 decades, the business world has increasingly recognized that the nature and quality of customers' experiences are the primary drivers of organic growth. These experiences are what attracts, engages, and extends the organization's profitable relationships with its customers. And there have been a wide range of studies that have confirmed that organizations that create the most attractive and compelling experiences can generate very substantial gains in revenue growth compared to their competitors. So as a result of this recognition, not surprisingly, organizations are investing very heavily in customer experience programs. We've reached the point where more than 80% of executives report that customer experience is one of their top strategic priorities. And the number of CX executive hires is growing by about 25% per year. And we've passed the threshold where global investment in CX now exceeds $100 billion a year. So here's the issue. Surprisingly few of the organizations that are making these investments can tie that investment to any strategically relevant improvement in growth performance. We're finding that a significant portion of this overall investment is in technology platforms that include CRM, digital platforms for interacting with customers and so forth. And there have been numerous studies that have shown a surprisingly high failure rate in achieving measurable increases in actual growth performance. And we're finding that industry analysts are observing that this massive investment in CX is really not moving the needle on the overall quality of the experiences customers are having. So why is this, if we go to the next page here? The underlying reason that these experience investments are not driving growth is that they're not structured to drive growth. They're structured to incrementally enhance the current set of experiences. So as Alistair was pointing out, the difference between a future back perspective versus a present forward perspective. The dominant focus for most organizations is on improving satisfaction, net promoter score, addressing areas where there is a significant amount of customer effort, or there are specific targeted experience issues or breakdowns. And that's across the existing set of customer touch points. We find that organizations are spending significant amount of energy mapping and trying to improve customer journeys that if you look at what customers really care about, the customers would rather not even be on a journey with the organization in that form and fashion. And so, as Alistair pointed out in the focus on a future back strategy perspective, one of the main reasons why the CX field is stuck is that virtually all of the activity is actually present forward, not future back. most of the programs are structured to improve on current set of experiences rather than actually creating the set of next generation experiences that will drive specific growth outcomes, specifically focused on where the organization is going. And as a result, these efforts end up trying to turn lots of dials on customer service levels and experience enhancements that only really amount to what we would characterize as better sameness. And these things don't really translate into growth. From our work, what we've learned is that in order to structure CX programs to drive growth, you actually need to work from right to left on this page rather than left to right. Define the set of business outcomes that are critical to the organization. Identify the most important customer behaviors that are at the heart of achieving those business outcomes, and then create a specific set of experiences that drive growth. So in other words, CX programs have to focus not on how you improve or even digitally enhance the existing set of experiences, but on how you achieve well-defined growth outcomes. For example, in many of the businesses that we've worked with, there are specific goals around, with one client we worked with recently, $500 million in additional growth over the next 2 to 3 years. So if you set a specific growth outcome, then you focus on what are the specific experiences that we need to create in order to achieve that growth outcome. And those experiences really need to more fundamentally transform customers' ability to do their underlying jobs to be done, not just incrementally enhance the way they engage with in the current experience that they're having with your business. And so here's the key question that I would ask all of you that are at least aware of the way your customer experience investments are structured in your organizations. How are they specifically tied to measurable growth outcomes? Are there examples that say we're going to get an extra X $100 million in growth over the next 2 to 3 years? Or are they primarily focused on a set of incremental enhancements to the current set of experiences? And I would say, if you really can't answer the question of how these experience investments are tied to growth, is a strong indicator that you're caught in this present forward and enhancement driven CX trap that's really at the heart of the disconnect that's driving why organizations are stuck. And then there's another key requirement which I'm going to go through on the next page here. And this is really where the central tenet of Synchrony comes in. These experience transformation efforts, and in fact, any transformation effort, really has to follow a holistic approach. Based on a wide range of the successful programs that we've been connected with, we've learned there's a specific way to go about this. There is a specific sequence to the way you develop and implement a transformation architecture that connects the experience that you need to create with a set of the specific desired outcomes. So, and these are illustrated in the set of points on this page here. So you start with a clear specification of the signature experiences that you need to create required to drive growth. And then focused on that set of signature experiences, the next step is figuring out how you're going to re-engineer the core and enabling business processes that allow the organization to deliver those specified experiences. Based on those processes, you can then determine how you're going to reorganize capabilities and structure roles and reporting relationships and the overall kind of structure of the organization so that they not only deliver the experience, but they effectively execute the processes that are related to enabling that experience. Once you have that defined, it informs the design of a set of management systems that enable you to measure and control the delivery of the experience, the execution of those processes, and the performance of the organization that was articulated in the previous steps. So coming to point number 5 here, then and only then do you really know enough to specify, design, and implement the systems, data, and platforms that enable the process, enable the organizational structure, and inform the management systems that are required to control and measure the delivery of the experience as well as the performance of the organization. And then finally, the challenge is how do you ensure that you've effectively addressed the cultural and behavioral barriers that impact how the organization engages its customers? What is often described as digital transformation is actually step 5 in this process. It's about the digital enablement of a transformed business model. Unfortunately, what happens most frequently, and is really part of the challenge that it articulated in that first page, is that for many organizations, step 5 becomes step 1. The organization starts with a goal of digital transformation and leaves defining all of the other elements until later. And I think to some extent, this is driven by a hope that implementing the technology is enough, rather than actually taking on clarity on the more substantial holistic changes that are required in the other dimensions of the business model. So the organization tends to focus on the technology without really knowing how the specific customer experiences are going to drive growth, and how the technology will enable those experiences, and how the business model really needs to change in order to be able to deliver that for customers. And so you're going to hear a whole lot more about both this outcomes-driven model and a much more holistic approach to transformation that really is the essence of business synchrony in the cases that follow. And so, well, we appreciate you taking time to participate in the program. I hope you guys enjoy the remainder of the presentations. If you have any questions about what we share, I know there's going to be a Q&A later, and of course, you can feel free to reach out to us at any time. So with that, enjoy the day. I'm going to pass it on to Mario, who's going to discuss the application of Synchrony to finance operations.
Hey, thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just as far as a little bit of background, I'll be guilty a little bit about what Frank said. I'm a technologist first and foremost, but I've been spending my last 25 years of my career specifically delivering solutions in the finance, risk, and risk management areas of organizations. So next slide here. Part of what I'm going to get into is really around, if you look at the digital finance organization, what does that look like? Most recently with the advent of the cloud and some of the ERP applications, we're going to see huge adoptions in digital, whether it's intelligent automation, cognitive innovations, analytics that's going to radically simplify processes within the finance area and free up time for finance professionals. Finance is going to be leaner here. You're going to be asked to do more with less. But when it comes to providing maybe reduction in process friction and integration flows, there should be an expectation that as organizations, specifically finance, move to digital, that you should be able to do more with less. There's plenty of work to be done within the finance function. What's going to be removed is really that hand-holding that's needed within finance professionals. They're going to be able to answer the questions quicker, with more reliability, with greater level of detail, and much more personalized as we start to embrace more and more technology and digital within the finance organization. As the future unfolds, the time of the spreadsheets are going to be replaced by very rich visual data and intuitive, easily used information. So understanding how technology is going to be affecting the Office of Finance. And then I know my colleague Jess is going to talk a bit more about the operating model of the futures. There is going to be a need to upskill, redeploy resources within finance. And we're working with an organization right now. It happens to be a finance institution, a bank specifically to revamp their finance function. As part of the transformation and new operating model that's being created, the number one priority of our business sponsor was to upskill and recruit individuals that have the ability to acquire vast amount of data to help predict customer behaviors, product performance, and identify portfolio risk. So think about what this person is asking for. We're looking about individuals that add value back to the business versus how do I process a transaction most effectively? How do I close the books quicker? It's really about understanding data and data analytics. The other part of this is that if we're going to attract the most sophisticated level of talent, to make sure that they're engaged, we have to give them the tools to actually operate the most effectively. The last thing we want to do is bring in talent, give them spreadsheets, have them forced to go get data manually before they can add value to the business. So as we're looking at transforming the finance function, you have to look at it not only from a people transformation, which we'll get into later, but also enabling them with the tools and the technologies to be productive in the new ways they're doing business. A lot of what we're seeing right now as it pertains to the cloud technologies, and I'll get into this a little bit, the platforms are there. How do you actually integrate those platforms into your organization? How do you integrate those into your people transformation? That's going to dictate the high success ratios that you're going to need to be successful, or potentially the failure if you're not looking at it more holistically here. Okay, let's get to the next slide. So we talked a lot about our journey, so I'm not going to drain the journey from silo to synchronized, but I do want to touch upon a couple things here. One thing is very relevant, that the finance leaderships need to move aggressively away from kind of this siloed, what I'll call people-centric. And what I mean by people-centric is, as workload increase, adding more people to solve that workload isn't the optimal solution, right? Too much time and effort is spent collecting, governing, really understanding the finance function, instead of looking at opportunities to streamline, automate, and eliminate the friction that exists within organizations. To achieve that transformation, we believe there's a couple key areas that we really need to look at. You've heard Frank, you've heard Alistair talk about looking at it from a future back approach. So what is that end state? What does it look like? And then not look at the present forward, but look at that end state and then work backwards to define what the new operating model needs to look like. So when we talk about defining that new operating model, which operations are going to be largely automated? Where do I double down on understanding how do I give my organizations that insight? What skills are going to be needed in the future that's going to be very dramatically different than what the current workforce really looks like right now? How do I eliminate and execute on that frictionless process? When we're adopting new technology, whether it be the cloud, whether it looks at intelligent automations, how do we integrate tighter so that we can eliminate friction within an organization and move towards more real time? The age of predictive reporting is no longer going to drive kind of that business operations and decision making. The annual budgeting process, the monthly forecasting, the monthly close, those are going to move much more towards a real-time environment. So you're closing on a real-time basis, you're making decisions on a more real-time environment. So these processes that exist now, in the future, as well as by reducing kind of the friction that exists, those are going to change. And what's that business model that's going to be needed to support those changes, right? So if we look at ERP vendors, they're already building those digital components around automation, blockchain, cognitive tools into their products. If we look at the landscape, new players are being introduced every day around microservices that exist within those ERP environments. So one thing that we know, the technology is going to be there to support reducing the friction within the organization, ultimately freeing up time. So what does that now look like in the future? It's really around the decision making and making sure that what the new asset becomes is really around data. The proliferation of new data structures, the concept of mastering and creating data governance and making sure that your data is clean, that's what's ultimately going to give you speed to market, speed to decision, and accuracy. So we're seeing a lot of organizations, specifically finance, create infrastructure that is supporting data as their asset, and understanding the importance of that and making sure that really focusing on master data management and making sure that from a governance standpoint, that data is indeed accurate in their decision making. Next slide here. So, listen, from an audience standpoint, many of you already know the value added and non-value added activities. I'll mention that, we could talk about non-value added activities, but I don't want to diminish that. It's still very important that those activities get done. The real question is, as you go through your journey, what are you going to do around the time savings and the cost savings of your organization? How are you going to act differently? Okay. So let me maybe, talk a little bit of a personal journey. Huron just went through our own finance and digital transformation. 12 months ago, we decided to undertake our own Synchrony. We're synchronizing sales with finance, with HR. We really wanted to reduce the friction and increase the transparency, being a global company. Historically, we look at sales pipelines, staffing models, financial models, and ultimately try to piece all this together in an operating model that ultimately allowed us to service our customers. We had a lot of friction in our systems that we created over time, handing data off from one silo to the next silo to the next silo. Since we've implemented and gone through this journey, we've now integrated our sales CRM platform, our finance ERP platform, with our HR HCM platform. Me as a business leader now, is I can look at actuals with my backlog, my pipeline, understand my forecast, that then informs me on how to deliver successfully and the resources and talent I need to execute for my clients. What historically has taken days and weeks, I do in real time. So now I'm freeing up my team, and we're freeing up our finance function to really add value back to our employees and our customers in making those decisions. So, having lived through the last 12 months of our own transformation, it's not easy, but the rewards do transform the way we operate as an organization, and we're seeing tremendous benefits in that now. So I asked the question, what are you going to do differently? How are you going to operate differently as you go through your transformation journey? So as we explore new business model, now's a perfect time for me to hand it over to Jess, as she's going to talk about new operating models that are going to be needed to succeed in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Mario. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a managing director with Huron, and I've worked for the past 20 years in performance improvement and IT implementations. I spent the first decade really focused just in IT and finance. So that's my original background. And then the last decade really focusing on doing these improvements across the enterprise. So what I'm going to focus on today is really talking about that concept of human capital management, and really what I think of as the people side of our implementations and the work that we do. And first off, why do we want to focus on this? Why is it important? Well, the number one, and I think it's probably the most obvious for everybody, is we want to get that ROI out of this implementation, out of this investment that we're making. We frequently invest millions of dollars in these system and IT implementation projects, and we want to make sure we get the value from that. We also obviously want to make sure we're getting economies of scale, increased efficiency, reducing our operational costs. We want to not just reskill, but up-level our talents and make sure that all of our teams are working at the top of their capabilities. We want to make sure we have a really consistent culture and way of working and talking about what we do. Now, I've got to be honest with you guys. When, as someone who started in IT and finance, I really kind of had to ask myself as we started to talk about people in this past decade of how do we really accelerate the people side of change. I just said, well, are those soft skills, is that something that really is meaningful? Do we really know that that's an important component of this? And here's the good news. As we take a look at the next slide, we see there's actually 20 years of research that tells us unequivocally, yes, there is actually value in investing in the people side of change. So what we see here is we take a look at organizations that really invested in that excellence, in that change process, and I'll talk a little bit about what excellence looks like. 80% experienced inline or better speed of adoption, 78% experienced inline or better utilization of their new systems and processes, and 80% experienced inline or better user proficiency of those new systems and processes. So basically, by making that investment up front, we had people using our systems sooner, more people were utilizing them, and they were more effective in their use of them compared to those that made a poor or fair investment, really experience only 19% speed of adoption, 17% utilization, and 19% proficiency. So a pretty dramatic difference between those two. But again, what does that really mean from a dollars and cents perspective? So if you take a look at the right-hand side there, we can see what that means is that those that, again, made that excellent investment, they really focused on that change component, 94% of them met the objectives of their transformational change, 71% stayed on or ahead of schedule, and 81% stayed on or under their budget. So pretty dramatic as compared to those numbers down below where you see 29%, 23%, 55%. So when we consider all of those dollars and cents, there really is a calculation here that tells us making that excellence, that investment in that excellence, which is usually around about 10% of your overall project budget when you think about working on that cultural change, is really what you want to do to ensure that you're going to see that success. Now, I'll tell you frequently what I run into as I talk to clients that are struggling with this is I'll meet with them and they'll say, Jess, about a year ago, we implemented a new human capital management system. We implemented a new finance system. We implemented a new medical record. We're really just not seeing that benefit. We're not seeing those economies of scale or those ROI. And when I ask them, well, how did you approach your people side of change? It usually falls into this concept of those poor or fair investments, which really is, well, we took some time we sent out regular emails to make sure everyone understood the changes that were happening and they were up to date on what was happening. And then as we got close to implementing those new systems and processes, we held large group trainings so that everyone could join either in person or over a webinar to really understand the functionality of the new tool. And well, you know what, I have to tell you all that's great. You should definitely start there. Those are essential steps to take, but those are just the first steps. Those steps create awareness for an organization around the change that's happening. But to get to that excellence, we actually need to take that further and make sure that people have the desire around that change. They understand the what's in it for me around accomplishing that change. They have the skill sets that they need to do that change. So have we not just given them training on the functionality, but does Jess Jones know how to go in and access the report she needs to access in the new system to be effective in her every day, to Mario's example where something that used to take weeks to get that information back and forth, I can now access on my own directly. And then the last and probably biggest piece that we see frequently gets missed is we don't reinforce that change. So often when we do these big implementations, our risk mitigation strategy means that we make the decision to make sure everyone can still do things the old way, so we don't have any disruption in the business. Well, the problem is then a year later, guess what? Everybody's just still doing things the old way. We haven't found ways to reinforce and invest in our people to make sure they're actually using those new systems and processes. Now, as we take a look at the next slide, the good news is while these are soft skills that we tend to call them, there are ways that we can be very strategic and measurable in how we approach that with our people. And this framework will look a little familiar. Mario touched on this earlier. So first off, really thinking about our operating model. Sorry, you can go back one. And when we think about our operating model and the different components within that, so do we really have the right organizational structures in place? Do we have the right management processes in the way that we're working with our different employees? And a big one, do we have KPIs that are going to help us measure during and after that we're holding ourselves accountable to? And do we have the right governance structure in place? And I know Tuffy's going to talk about this more later today as well. Looking at our talent strategy, are we executing in the way where even, for example, do we have the right recruitment strategy? Are we bringing in the right new people based on that future vision with these new systems and processes? So for example, I spend a lot of my time actually working with large, complex healthcare organizations. And a lot of healthcare right now is actually making a shift for their non-clinical roles, saying, we actually want to start to bring in people that don't have healthcare experience, that come in from other industries to bring in new types of talent into the work that we're doing in healthcare. So are we really looking in the mirror and saying, do we have the right recruitment strategies in place to support that in those individuals? And then lastly, those beliefs and behaviors. Are we actually really measuring and thinking about the values, the goal alignment, the way we approach collaboration and leadership effectiveness to make sure that we are fully prepared to support that cultural change? And while I know, again, we often think of this as very soft, the reality is there are a lot of tools out there that we can use to measure each of these components to support the change as we move along. And then on this last slide, just very briefly, I'll touch on here, when we really think about what does excellence look like within those three components, operating model, talent strategy, and ways of working, we really want to get to that operating model that is very agile and streamlined and allows us to make those accelerated, nimble decisions across the organization. We want to consider our talent strategy and even think about how we're tying performance, not to transactional productivity, but to broader business insights and goals so that everybody has a stake in the success of the organization. And then lastly, really thinking about those ways of working, those beliefs and behaviors so that we can shift from that know-it-all mindset to that learn-it-all mindset, which really means everybody goes into every interaction with their colleagues with those opportunities rather than thinking, how am I going to defend my position? To success looks like me asking questions and working with my colleagues to figure out how I can improve. So that's a really quick overview of our human capital management framework. And I know we'll be talking about that more later today in some of the examples that our clients are going to share with you as well. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
So I have a couple of questions. The first one is to you, Mario. So if you could come on the screen and help answer this question for us. So we have a couple of questions around data. So one of the questions is, Mario, is how should we be approaching the management of data so that it is being used efficiently and actually used to make informed business decisions?
Yeah, so again, I mentioned this a little bit about the governing of financial data and financial data management. One of the areas that we've been really successful is basically watermarking the book of records. So how many times do finance people come in with their individual spreadsheets and my numbers don't match your numbers? What's the accounting, term is, basically I can make the numbers tell any story I need to based upon what the story I'm trying to tell, right? So one of the areas that we focus a lot about our time is around that business information model. It's probably a term that gets overused, but what is that one version of the truth? But more importantly, where do you go find that one version of the truth within the organization? And to do that effectively is standing up an organization that's specifically focused on that financial data governance and making sure that that has relevance throughout the rest of the organization.
Well, thank you, Mario. The next question I'm going to pose to Alistair. So Alistair, will you come on, please? So the question for you, Alistair, is how do we get started on a transformational journey and ideas on how to get executives on board?
It's a good question. I think the key challenge here is alignment, right? So a lot of the times when we work with executive teams, you have a situation where there is one or more agitators that there be change, right? Sometimes that comes from board pressure. Sometimes that is as a result of a new CEO in role. Sometimes it might be someone reporting up through the C-suite that has a clear vision of where the organization needs to go. But the fundamental challenge here is that there isn't alignment because that leadership team, represents competing functions, different experiences that they've had in their sort of journeys, professional and personal otherwise, such that there is no sense of a mandate for change. So typically the way we think about, the initial step is you've got to create a mandate for change, right? And the way we think about that is it's a juxtaposition of two things. Firstly, you have to acknowledge as a leadership team, sort of the historical success formula. What does the ecosystem, is a word I used earlier, look like? Why have we been successful? What is it that's made us tick? How have we differentiated? And how has that led to this incredible period that's led us to where we are today? But then you have to set that aside and have that discussion as a leadership team about what the future might look like. And that's a hard thing to do, right? Leadership teams often, everyone's seen the email that flies around with whether it's the cool new video, the list of trends. And in fact, when we talk to leadership teams, it's pretty common that everyone lists the same 5 trends they should be worried about. But when you start to pick below the surface of those trends, what it turns out is that a lot of people are not aligned on the implication of that trend to the business and the time frame in which that trend will really matter, i.e. it will start hitting your margins or your cost structure or your revenues. So what we like to do is have a really substantive discussion with leaders that's fact-based and customer-based and future-oriented. What will customers look like in the future? Sometimes there's facts that drive that. Sometimes it just needs a leadership team to say, look, we're all looking at the data. We recognize there's a bit of ambiguity, but we're going to put a stake in the ground about what the future looks like. And then it becomes what is the aspiration? Given what that future looks like, where do we want to be? And the juxtaposition comes from acknowledging that what got us here, the first part of that discussion, isn't what's going to get us there. We actually need to do something different. And so when we work with organizations, engaging on digital transformation, our first step is actually to set the digital aside, put the customer at the center, put the future in the center and say, what are we trying to become? Why do we need to act? Is there a mandate for change? And only then move on to some of the technology or process implications that we've discussed today.